It was a cool evening, and Zendi was enjoying a peaceful stroll down one of the city's busiest streets. The air was alive with the sounds of people chatting, car horns in the distance, and vendors calling out to advertise their goods. The smell of freshly grilled hot dogs, roasted nuts, and spicy street food wafted through the air, mixing with the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. Zendi liked moments like this. After a long day, there was something relaxing about blending into the crowd, walking without a specific destination, and soaking in the energy around her. She was passing by a brightly lit hot dog cart when something caught her attention, a sharp, repetitive barking. It wasn't the kind of bark she was used to hearing from stray dogs looking for scraps. This bark sounded different, urgent and commanding, as if the dog was trying to get someone's attention. Curious, Zendi turned her head toward the noise and spotted the source, a scruffy, medium-sized dog standing a few feet away from the cart. Its fur was unkempt but clean enough to suggest it hadn't been on the streets for long. Its ears stood tall, and its eyes were locked firmly on the vendor behind the cart. The dog's body was tense, its tail pointing straight, and every few seconds, it barked again, loud and clear. People nearby seemed completely uninterested. They walked past without a second glance, too busy checking their phones, chatting with friends, or heading to their next destination. Even the vendor looked unfazed, wiping his hands on a towel as if the barking was just background noise. But Zendi stopped. She couldn't ignore the intensity in the dog's behavior. There was no hint of fear or desperation in the way it barked, no sign that it was begging for food. It seemed entirely focused on the vendor, like it was trying to communicate something. "What's up with you, little guy?" Zendi murmured, her curiosity piqued. She stepped a little closer, her sneakers tapping softly on the pavement. The vendor noticed her and let out an annoyed sigh. "Don't mind that dog," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "It's been hanging around here all day, barking at nothing. Just an annoying stray." Zendi's eyes narrowed slightly. The vendor's tone didn't sit right with her. She glanced at the dog again. Its barking wasn't random. It was sharp and deliberate, like an alarm going off. The dog wasn't moving much either, just circling the cart in slow, calculated steps. Ignoring the vendor's comment, Zendi crouched down a few feet away from the dog. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly. "What's going on? Why all the noise?" The dog turned its head toward her briefly, its bright, intelligent eyes meeting hers. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether to trust her. But after a second, it went right back to barking at the vendor. It wasn't interested in her, not yet. Its focus was entirely on the man behind the cart. Zendi straightened up, her gaze shifting between the dog and the vendor. Something wasn't adding up. The dog's behavior was too specific, too purposeful to be written off as random barking. It wasn't begging, it wasn't scared, and it wasn't being playful. It was alert, almost like it was guarding something. "Why is it barking at you?" Zendi asked, her voice calm but curious. The vendor shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "How should I know? Dogs bark at everything. Probably just hungry. You should keep walking." Zendi crossed her arms. "Hungry dogs usually go for the food. This one hasn't even sniffed at your cart." The vendor chuckled nervously and picked up a towel, wiping imaginary dirt off the side of his cart. "Look, lady, it's just a stray. They're everywhere. Trust me, it's not a big deal." But Zendi wasn't convinced. The vendor was too quick to dismiss her questions, and the dog's behavior didn't match his explanation. She studied the dog more closely. Its tail remained stiff, its eyes never leaving the vendor. Occasionally, it growled softly, almost like it was warning the man about something. Zendi crouched again and rummaged through her bag, pulling out a piece of bread she had saved from earlier. "Here, boy," she said, holding it out. "You hungry?" The dog glanced at the bread for a split second but didn't take it. Instead, it stepped closer to the cart and barked again, pawing lightly at the ground beneath it. Zendi frowned. "You're not hungry, huh? Then what's the deal?" The vendor huffed, clearly irritated now. "Look, I don't have time for this. It's just a stray being annoying, all right? I need to get back to work." But Zendi noticed something. The vendor's hands were fidgeting now, moving the items on his cart unnecessarily, almost as if he were stalling. The dog barked louder, and the man flinched slightly before turning away. "All right," Zendi thought to herself, "something's definitely not right here." The dog let out another sharp bark, circling the cart again. Zendi stepped back slightly, watching closely. She didn't know what the dog was trying to do, but one thing was clear, it wasn't leaving until something was resolved. Her curiosity deepened. Most people would have walked away by now, but Zendi decided to stay. Whatever was going on, she was determined to figure it out. The dog barked again, and this time it seemed even more urgent, like it was demanding someone pay attention. Zendi glanced at the vendor one more time, then back at the dog. "All right, buddy," she murmured. "I'll stay and see this through. Let's figure out what's really going on here." Zendi stood a few feet away from the hot dog cart, her attention fixed on the scruffy dog that wouldn't stop barking. Its sharp, steady barks echoed down the busy street, cutting through the chatter and noise around them. Despite the vendor's attempts to wave it off, the dog refused to move, pacing back and forth with its eyes locked on the cart. The vendor sighed loudly and shook his head. "I told you, it's just a stray. It keeps barking for no reason, probably crazy or sick," he muttered, trying to dismiss Zendi's concern. But Zendi wasn't so sure. She'd seen stray dogs before. They usually barked at people for attention or food or out of fear. This was different. The dog wasn't looking for scraps, and it didn't seem scared. Instead, it acted like it knew something no one else did. The vendor bent down to pick up a small box that had been sitting under the cart. The moment he touched it, the dog's barking grew louder and more aggressive. It darted forward, stopping just short of the vendor, growling and pawing at the ground as if warning him to stop. Zendi's eyebrows shot up. "That's not normal," she thought. The vendor froze for a second, his hands gripping the box tightly. Then he chuckled nervously and set it back down, pretending it was nothing. "See what I mean?" "Crazy dog," he said, forcing a smile. But Zendi noticed how his movements had changed. His hands were shaking now, and his eyes kept darting toward the dog, like he was worried about what it might do next. The dog continued barking, circling the cart with its tail stiff and its ears pinned forward. It wasn't giving up, and its behavior made Zendi even more curious. She stepped closer to the vendor. "Why is the dog so focused on your cart?" she asked directly. The vendor scoffed, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. "I don't know. Dogs bark. Maybe it smells something it likes. Look, I've got nothing to hide, all right?" Zendi raised an eyebrow. His tone was defensive, almost guilty. She glanced at the cart and noticed the way the vendor had positioned himself in front of it, like he was trying to block something from view. The dog let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it pawed at the cart again. Zendi knelt down and reached out a hand, trying to calm it. "Hey boy, what's going on? What are you trying to tell us?" The dog didn't look at her. Its entire focus was on the vendor. Zendi pulled her hand back and stood up. "All right, you're not barking for nothing," she murmured. The vendor suddenly started moving, rearranging items on the cart and shifting the box around. "Look, I don't have time for this," he said quickly. "I've got customers to serve, and this dog's scaring them away. You should just go." Zendi crossed her arms, not budging. "I'm not leaving until I figure out why this dog is acting like this. It's not normal." The vendor sighed loudly, clearly frustrated, and glanced around as if hoping someone would step in and back him up. But no one was paying attention, except for Zendi and the dog. Just then, the dog barked again, louder than ever, and jumped toward the cart. It didn't touch anything, but it came so close that the vendor flinched and took a step back. "All right, that's enough." The vendor snapped, grabbing his towel and tossing it over the cart. "This is ridiculous." But to Zendi, it wasn't ridiculous at all. Something was definitely off, and the dog seemed to know it. She kept her eyes on the vendor, noticing how his hands trembled slightly as he moved. The dog, meanwhile, stayed locked in place, growling softly as if it was ready to pounce at any moment. "Whatever's going on here," Zendi thought, "this dog isn't going to let it slide. And honestly, neither am I." She stepped to the side, trying to get a better look at the cart. The vendor shifted quickly to block her view, his expression growing more irritated. The dog barked once more, its tail stiff as a board. Zendi looked down at it and nodded slightly. "All right, buddy. I'll stick around. Let's see what you're trying to tell us." The vendor's face twitched, and Zendi could tell he wasn't happy about her decision to stay. That only made her more determined. She wasn't leaving until she got some answers. Zendi stood her ground, arms crossed, watching the dog circle the cart with unrelenting focus. The vendor was clearly uncomfortable now, fidgeting with the items on his cart and glancing around like he was hoping someone would come to his rescue. But no one nearby seemed to notice or care. The dog let out another sharp bark, its gaze never leaving the vendor. Then it crouched slightly, its nose sniffing the ground near the cart as if it were following a scent trail. It paused near one corner, growled low, and pawed at the spot, its movements quick and deliberate. Zendi crouched down next to the dog. "What are you trying to show me, huh?" she said softly, her tone more curious than ever. She reached out her hand again, but just like before, the dog ignored her. It was entirely focused on the cart. The vendor sighed loudly and took a step forward. "Lady, seriously, it's just a stray. It probably smells something from earlier. I spilled some sauce under there." "That's all it is," he said, his voice shaky despite his casual words. Zendi straightened up, her sharp eyes narrowing at him. "If it's just sauce, why are you so jumpy?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The vendor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the dog barked again and lunged forward, stopping just short of the cart. Its paws hit the metal frame with a loud clang, making the vendor flinch visibly. "Hey, Get back. The vendor snapped, waving his towel at the dog like he was trying to shoo away a fly. But the dog didn't back down. Instead, it growled and stood its ground, its tail stiff and its eyes fixed on the vendor. Zendi took a step closer, her curiosity growing by the second. There's no way this is about food, she thought. This dog isn't begging, it's trying to tell me something. The vendor bent down and grabbed the box the dog had been pawing at earlier. He moved it to the other side of the cart, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. They're happy now, he muttered, avoiding eye contact with Zendi. But the dog wasn't done. It quickly moved to follow the box, circling the cart again and barking louder than before. Zendi couldn't help but notice how precise its movements were. There was nothing random or frantic about the way it moved. It was like the dog knew exactly what it was doing. Zendi crouched down again, watching the dog carefully. "You're not giving up, are you?" she murmured with a small smile. "All right, let's see where this goes." She reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of bread she packed as a snack. "Here, boy," she said, holding it out. "Are you hungry?" The dog glanced at the bread for barely a second before turning its attention back to the cart. It barked again, its tail wagging slightly as if to say, "Focus on this instead." Zendi blinked, surprised. Most stray dogs would have jumped at the chance for food, but not this one. It was completely uninterested in the bread, and entirely focused on whatever was under that cart. "You're really not letting this go, are you?" she said, standing up and crossing her arms. The vendor let out a forced laugh, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "See? It's just crazy. Who knows what's going on in a dog's head, right? You should really just keep walking." But Zendi wasn't buying it. Crazy? No, this dog knows something, and I'm going to figure out what it is. The vendor's forced smile faltered. He adjusted his towel on his shoulder and started fiddling with the handles of his cart, avoiding Zendi's gaze. The dog growled softly, its sharp eyes tracking his every move. Zendi noticed the vendor's nervousness. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be sweating, even though the evening air was cool. The dog barked again, louder this time, as if it could sense the tension. Zendi decided to push further. "Why does the dog keep focusing on your cart?" she asked, her tone direct. "If it's just a stray barking for no reason, why are you so nervous?" The vendor's face reddened. "I'm not nervous," he snapped. "I just don't like people hanging around my cart when they're not buying anything." Zendi raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because it seems like you're trying to hide something." The vendor opened his mouth to protest, but the dog interrupted with a sharp bark, its head snapping toward one specific corner of the cart. It growled and pawed at the ground again, its movements growing more frantic. Zendi stepped to the side, trying to get a better look. "What's over there?" she asked, moving closer. The vendor quickly stepped in front of her, blocking her view. "Nothing. Just some supplies I keep under the cart. Nothing worth looking at." The dog barked again, almost as if it were arguing with him. Zendi's eyes narrowed. "All right, buddy," she thought, looking at the dog. "I'm listening. Let's figure this out." She took a step back, giving herself space to observe both the dog and the vendor. The dog was relentless, barking and growling at the cart with a focus that felt almost human. And the vendor? He looked like he was ready to bolt. Zendi couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening here. Whatever it was, the dog clearly wasn't going to let it slide, and neither was she. Zendi watched the dog bark louder, its paws scratching at the ground near the cart. It was relentless now, completely focused on something beneath the vendor's cart. Every growl, every bark, every movement screamed that the dog knew something important. The vendor bent down quickly, grabbing the small box the dog kept targeting. His hands trembled as he pulled it closer to himself, holding it tightly. "Look, I already told you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is nothing. Just supplies. I don't know why this mutt keeps going crazy." But Zendi wasn't buying it. She had been watching his every move, and his actions only made her more suspicious. The way he clutched the box, the way his voice wavered, everything about him screamed that he was hiding something. The dog, as if sensing the box's importance, lunged forward suddenly, its nose pressing against the vendor's hand. The man yelped in surprise and pulled the box back, nearly dropping it in his panic. "Hey, stop it," the vendor shouted, stepping back to protect the box. His reaction only made the situation more suspicious. Zendi took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "If it's nothing, why are you so worried about the box?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The vendor hesitated, his eyes darting between Zendi and the dog. "I'm not worried. It's just, look, this is private. None of your business." Before Zendi could respond, the dog barked again and jumped toward the cart, its front paws hitting the edge with a loud clang. The force caused the cart to wobble slightly, and the box slipped from the vendor's grip, landing on the ground with a dull thud. The dog was on it in an instant. Its nose pushed the box open, and the contents spilled out across the pavement. Bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in rubber bands, tumbled out in plain view. Zendi froze for a moment, her eyes widening at the sight. The vendor let out a panicked gasp and dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather the money. "Hey, don't touch that," he shouted, his voice frantic. "This is mine. It's my business money." But Zendi wasn't convinced. She crouched down, picking up one of the bundles and turning it over in her hand. The bills were crisp, too clean, and there were far too many for a simple hot dog vendor to have earned in a day, or even a week. "Business money?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "This doesn't look like the kind of cash you get selling hot dogs." The vendor snatched the bundle from her hand, his face pale. "What do you know?" he snapped. "It's none of your business." The dog, however, wasn't done. It pawed at the ground near the cart again, barking loudly as if to say, "There's more." Zendi stood up and stepped back, giving the dog room to work. "What else is under there, buddy?" she asked, her tone encouraging. The vendor's face twisted into a mix of frustration and fear. "I already told you, there's nothing else. Just let me clean up and go." But the dog wasn't letting him off the hook. It sniffed around the base of the cart, growling softly, before zeroing in on another small bag tucked beneath the cart's frame. Zendi noticed the bag immediately. It was small, black, and slightly hidden behind one of the wheels. "What's in there?" she asked, pointing at it. The vendor stepped forward quickly, trying to block her view. "Nothing. It's just supplies, extra napkins and stuff. You don't need to see it." But the dog wasn't waiting for permission. It darted forward, grabbing the corner of the bag in its teeth and yanking it out from under the cart. The vendor let out a panicked shout and tried to grab it, but Zendi was faster. She snatched the bag from the ground before the vendor could reach it. Ignoring his protests, she unzipped it and peeked inside. Her heart skipped a beat. Inside the bag was a cracked phone, its screen buzzing with notifications. Messages were popping up one after another, and they all seemed strange, strings of numbers, symbols, and what looked like coordinates. Zendi glanced up at the vendor, whose face was now ashen. "This is a lot of effort to hide a broken phone," she said calmly, holding the bag up. The vendor stammered, his hands wringing nervously. It's personal. Just give it back." The dog barked again, standing protectively in front of Zendi, as if it knew the vendor was up to no good. Zendi's mind raced. The cash was suspicious enough, but the phone added another layer to the mystery. Why would a hot dog vendor have hidden stacks of cash and a phone buzzing with strange messages? She took a step back, keeping the bag out of the vendor's reach. "You're hiding something, and it's not just business money," she said, her voice steady. "What's really going on here?" The vendor's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But with Zendi holding the bag and the dog growling at his every move, he was cornered. For a moment, no one moved. The vendor stood frozen. Zendi watched him closely, and the dog remained alert, ready for whatever came next. Zendi glanced down at the phone again. The buzzing had stopped, but the last message was still on the screen. It was a set of coordinates, somewhere not far from where they stood. She looked at the dog, whose tail wagged slightly as it stared at her. "You're not done yet, are you?" she said softly. The dog barked once, as if in response, and Zendi knew this was just the beginning. The air felt tense as Zendi stood, holding the black bag with the buzzing phone inside. The dog, still on high alert, paced between her and the vendor, its growls low but steady. The vendor, on the other hand, looked like he was about to break out in a cold sweat. His eyes darted nervously between Zendi and the bag, his entire demeanor screaming guilt. "All right," Zendi said, breaking the silence. "Why don't you start explaining? Because this," she held up the bag, "doesn't exactly look like napkins and ketchup." The vendor threw his hands up defensively. "Look, I already told you. It's nothing. Just give it back, okay? That's private property." His voice cracked slightly as he tried to sound more confident than he felt. The dog barked sharply, almost as if it were calling him out on his lie. It took a step forward, standing protectively near Zendi's leg. Zendi raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. "Private property? You mean this bag you were trying to keep hidden under your cart? And let's not forget the stacks of cash. Care to explain how a hot dog vendor makes that kind of money?" The vendor stammered, his face turning red. It's my savings. That's all it is. I don't trust banks, all right? Is that a crime?" He laughed nervously, but it only made him seem more suspicious. Zendi glanced down at the phone inside the bag, its cracked screen now silent but still glowing faintly. "Your savings? Huh. And this phone. What are these weird messages about? Coordinates? Looks like you're not running a regular food cart, are you?" The vendor clenched his fists, his tone growing defensive. "What do you know about running a business, huh? You think it's easy? I work hard every day, early mornings, late nights. That money's mine. The phone's mine. None of this is your business." Zendi didn't flinch, her calm gaze meeting his frantic one. You're awfully defensive for someone who says they've got nothing to hide." The dog barked again, stepping closer to the vendor. Its eyes were sharp, and its body was tense, ready to act if needed. The vendor took an involuntary step back, clearly unnerved by the dog's presence. Zendi crouched down for a moment, patting the dog lightly. "I think you've been onto something this whole time," she murmured to it, before standing up again. "This dog clearly knows something isn't right, and judging by how hard you're trying to get me to leave, I'd say it's not wrong." The vendor's eyes darted around the street, as if searching for a way out. "Fine," he snapped. "You think you've figured it all out, huh? You think you're some kind of detective? You've got no proof. None of this proves anything." Zendi tilted her head, smirking slightly. "If it's no big deal, why are you so worked up? You've been fidgeting and sweating since this dog showed up." The vendor opened his mouth to respond but stopped when the dog growled again, low and threatening. He glared at it, his frustration boiling over. "Stupid mutt," he muttered under his breath. Zendi took another step closer to him, holding the bag firmly. "You can call the dog whatever you want, but it's not going anywhere, and neither am I." For a moment, the vendor seemed to consider his options. His breathing was heavy, and his hands were twitching by his sides. But Zendi could see it in his eyes. He was calculating. He wasn't going to give her the truth willingly. The dog, however, wasn't waiting for him to come clean. It sniffed the ground again, its nose brushing against the wheel of the cart. Then suddenly, it barked sharply and started pawing at a spot near the back of the cart. Zendi's eyes followed its movements, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small latch. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the spot the dog was focused on. The vendor stepped in front of her quickly, blocking her view. "Nothing, just part of the cart. You're wasting your time." Zendi stepped to the side, her patience wearing thin. "Move," she said firmly. The vendor hesitated, but the dog didn't. It lunged toward the cart, its paws slamming against the latch. With a loud click, the latch popped open, revealing a hidden compartment underneath the cart. Zendi's jaw tightened as she leaned closer. Inside the compartment were more stacks of cash, along with several small, unmarked packages wrapped in brown paper. The vendor's face turned as pale as a sheet. "Care to explain this?" Zendi asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. The vendor stuttered, unable to form a coherent sentence. He reached out as if to close the compartment, but the dog barked loudly and blocked him, its teeth bared. Zendi held up her phone, snapping a quick photo of the hidden stash. "I'd say you've got some serious explaining to do." The vendor's face twisted with anger and desperation. "You don't understand. It's not what it looks like." Zendi raised an eyebrow. "It looks like you've got a lot of cash and some very suspicious packages hidden in your cart. What part of that am I misunderstanding?" The vendor took a step back, his hands raised as if to surrender. "Look, I didn't want any trouble. Just take the dog and go. Forget you saw anything." Zendi crossed her arms. "Not a chance." The dog growled, standing firm beside Zendi as if to back her up. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but there was still more to uncover, and she wasn't about to let this man off the hook. Whatever was going on, the dog wasn't going to stop until the truth was out, and neither was Zendi. Zendi stared at the open compartment under the vendor's cart. The bundles of cash and the strange, unmarked packages were suspicious enough, but her focus was on the buzzing phone still inside the bag in her hand. The cracked screen flickered faintly, and another notification popped up. It was a string of numbers and letters, random at first glance, but too deliberate to be a coincidence. The dog barked again, standing close to her, its body tense and ready. Its bright eyes flicked between the vendor and the bag, as if urging Zendi to keep looking. The vendor's voice broke through the moment. "That phone is private," he snapped, his words loud but shaky. "You have no right to look at it. Just give it back and leave." Zendi ignored him, pulling the phone out of the bag. She tapped the screen, and though the cracks made it hard to read, the notifications were clear enough. Each message looked the same: numbers, coordinates, and short phrases like "package ready" or "drop confirmed." Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a regular phone, and it definitely wasn't being used for anything legal. She scrolled through a few more messages, noting the times and dates. They were all recent, and the coordinates in the messages seemed to point to different locations. "What are these?" she asked, holding up the phone. "Coordinates? Drops? Are these connected to whatever's under your cart?" The vendor stepped back, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly. "It's nothing. Just give me the phone. It's not yours." The dog growled low, stepping closer to Zendi, its gaze fixed on the vendor. It wasn't backing down, and neither was she. Zendi turned her attention back to the phone. "If it's nothing, then why are you so desperate to get it back?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "And why were you hiding it in a bag under your cart?" The vendor's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't answer. Instead, he shifted nervously on his feet, his eyes darting toward the street as if planning an escape. The dog barked sharply, breaking the silence. Zendi glanced down at it and nodded slightly. "I don't think he's going to talk, buddy," she murmured to the dog, "but this phone might." She tapped on one of the messages, pulling up what appeared to be a map. A small pin was marked on a location just a few blocks away. Zendi tilted her head. "This is close," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "What's there? A warehouse? A storage unit?" The vendor's face turned pale. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just leave it alone. It's better that way." Zendi looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Better for who? You? Or whoever you're working for?" The vendor flinched but didn't respond. His silence said more than words ever could. Zendi's mind raced as she pieced things together. The hidden cash, the unmarked packages, the cryptic messages, it all pointed to something much bigger than a street vendor selling hot dogs. She turned back to the dog, crouching down to meet its gaze. "You brought me here for a reason, didn't you?" she asked softly. The dog barked once, its tail wagging slightly, as if confirming her suspicion. Zendi stood up, holding the phone tightly. "All right," she said, turning back to the vendor. "You're not going to tell me anything, are you?" The vendor shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. His defiance was crumbling under the weight of her questions, but he still refused to speak. The dog barked again and took a step toward the street, glancing back at Zendi as if to say, "Follow me." She looked down at the phone again, her thoughts racing. The map on the screen showed a clear path to the marked location, and the dog seemed ready to lead the way. Zendi took a deep breath. "All right, buddy," she said, slipping the phone back into the bag. "Let's go see what this is all about." The vendor stepped forward suddenly, his voice rising. "Wait, you can't." But he stopped himself, his words cut short by the dog's low, threatening growl. Zendi didn't hesitate. She turned and started walking, the dog trotting confidently by her side. The vendor didn't follow, though she could feel his eyes on her back as she disappeared into the crowd. As she moved further away from the cart, Zendi's determination grew. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. The dog had led her to something important, something dangerous, and she wasn't about to ignore it. The dog barked once more, a sharp, clear sound that echoed down the street. Zendi glanced at it and gave a small smile. "Lead the way, buddy," she said. And together, they headed toward the unknown. Zendi walked briskly down the bustling street, the phone bag slung over her shoulder and the scruffy dog trotting beside her. Its determined gait and sharp focus gave the impression it knew exactly where they were going. Every few steps, it would glance back at her, as if to check that she was still following. The evening crowd thickened as they moved closer to the city's quieter edges. Streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the hum of the crowd faded into the background. Zendi's mind raced as she pieced together the clues, the hidden cash, the strange packages, the cryptic messages on the phone. Whatever this was, it wasn't a simple misunderstanding. The dog barked sharply, breaking her thoughts. It veered off the main road, heading into a narrow alleyway. Zendi hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure she wasn't being followed. The vendor's nervous face flashed in her memory, but there was no sign of him. "All right, buddy," she murmured, taking a deep breath. "I'm trusting you." The dog's ears perked up at her voice, and it wagged its tail slightly before darting further into the alley. Zendi followed closely, her sneakers tapping softly against the concrete. The alley was lined with dumpsters and faded graffiti, the faint smell of garbage lingering in the cool air. Suddenly, the dog stopped in front of a rusted gate, its nose pressed to the ground. It sniffed intently, pawing at the base of the gate before letting out a low growl. Zendi approached cautiously, peering through the gaps in the gate's bars. On the other side was an open lot, dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. In the distance, she could make out the outline of a large building, old and weathered, with boarded-up windows and a faded sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. It looked like an abandoned warehouse. "This is the place," she said softly, glancing down at the dog. The dog barked once in response, as if confirming her guess. She pulled out the phone and reopened the map. The pin on the screen matched the location in front of her. The messages she'd seen earlier started to make more sense. This warehouse was a meeting point, a place for the drops and pickups hinted at in the texts. Zendi tried the gate, but it didn't budge. The rusted metal groaned loudly under her touch. The dog growled again, pacing in front of the gate before squeezing through a small gap at the bottom. "Of course you'd fit," she muttered with a smirk, watching the dog disappear on the other side. The dog barked sharply, its voice echoing in the empty lot. Zendi scanned the area and found a loose section of the gate where the metal had bent inward. She slipped through carefully, the edges of the gate scraping lightly against her jacket. Once inside, she crouched down beside the dog, keeping low as she surveyed the scene. The warehouse loomed ahead, its walls cracked and covered in peeling paint. A faint light flickered through one of the boarded-up windows, casting uneven shadows on the ground. "What are we walking into?" she whispered, her heart pounding. The dog moved ahead slowly, its nose close to the ground as it followed an invisible trail. Zendaya followed, keeping her steps light and her eyes on the building. As they drew closer, faint voices drifted through the air. She froze, her ears straining to pick up the conversation. The voices were muffled but urgent, overlapping in hurried tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the tension in their voices was clear. The dog stopped beside her, its ears swiveling toward the sound. It growled softly, and Zendaya placed a calming hand on its back. "Shh," she whispered. Carefully, she crept toward a stack of wooden crates piled near the warehouse wall. She crouched behind them, peeking around the edge to get a better view. Through a crack in the warehouse door, she saw them. A group of men gathered around a table piled high with cash and small packages. One man was counting money, while another sealed boxes with tape. A third man stood near the entrance, scanning the lot nervously as if expecting someone to show up. Zendaya's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just some small-time operation. This was organized. She pulled out her phone, switched to the camera, and started recording. Her hands were steady, and she made sure to capture the men's faces and the suspicious activity on the table. The dog stayed quiet beside her, its body tense but still. Suddenly, one of the men at the table slammed his hand down, causing the others to stop. He said something Zendaya couldn't hear, but the man near the entrance turned sharply, his eyes scanning the lot. Zendaya ducked behind the crates, her heart pounding. The dog pressed close to her, its growl so low it was barely audible. "Someone's out there," the man near the entrance said loudly, his voice cutting through the air. Zendaya's breath quickened. She clutched her phone tightly, her mind racing. "Stay calm," she thought. "Don't panic." The men started moving, their voices growing louder. Zendaya glanced at the dog, who was staring intently at the warehouse door. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. The dog seemed to understand. It barked once, quietly, before turning and leading her back toward the gate. Zendaya followed as quickly and silently as she could, her heart thundering in her chest. Behind them, the voices of the men grew more frantic. "Check outside," one of them shouted. "Don't let anyone get away." Zendaya slipped through the bent section of the gate just as the warehouse door creaked open. She didn't look back, focusing on keeping up with the dog as it darted into the alley. Once they were safely out of sight, she leaned against the wall, catching her breath. The dog sat at her feet, panting but alert. "Good work, buddy," she murmured, reaching down to ruffle its fur. "Now we've got what we need." With the video on her phone and the dog by her side, Zendaya knew she had uncovered something big. But this wasn't over yet. The men in the warehouse wouldn't stop until they figured out what had happened, and neither would she. Zendaya crouched near the corner of the alley, her back pressed against the cool brick wall as she caught her breath. The dog sat beside her, its ears perked up and its eyes focused on the path ahead. It was quiet now, but the tension in the air was thick. The dimly lit lot leading to the warehouse was just a few steps away. She peeked around the corner to scan the area. The warehouse loomed ahead, its cracked walls and broken windows giving it an abandoned, eerie look. But Zendaya knew better. It wasn't empty. She had seen the activity inside through the cracked door earlier. The light flickering from one of the windows and the muffled voices coming from within confirmed it. Something illegal was happening here. The dog gave a soft growl, bringing her back to the moment. She crouched down and looked at it. "All right, buddy," she whispered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The dog wagged its tail slightly, almost as if it understood. Without hesitation, it led the way, moving silently toward the side of the building. Zendaya followed, her steps careful and light, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. As they approached the warehouse, the voices became clearer. Through a small crack in the wall, Zendaya could see a group of men gathered around a table. She ducked lower, finding a better vantage point behind an old stack of crates. From her hidden position, she could see them clearly now. 4 men were in the room. One was counting stacks of cash, his hands moving quickly as he made neat piles. Another man was sealing small, unmarked boxes with thick rolls of tape, while the other 2 stood watch. One of the guards glanced toward the entrance every few seconds, his posture tense, as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Zendaya's heart raced as she observed the scene. She opened her phone's camera and hit the record button. Slowly and steadily, she aimed it through the crack, capturing everything: the men's faces, the piles of cash, and the boxes on the table. The dog crouched beside her, silent but alert. It stared at the men through the crack, its body tense. Zendaya couldn't help but marvel at how calm and focused it was. This dog wasn't just clever, it was fearless. Suddenly, one of the men slammed his hand on the table, making Zendaya jump slightly. The man spoke loudly, his tone sharp. "We need to move faster. The boss isn't going to wait forever," he said. "Relax," another man replied. "We're almost done. Just keep counting." The first man didn't look convinced. He turned to one of the guards and said, "Check outside. Make sure no one's snooping around." Zendi's breath caught. Her eyes darted to the warehouse door, which creaked open as the guard stepped out. She ducked lower behind the crates, her heart pounding in her chest. The dog gave a soft growl but stayed in place, as if it knew now wasn't the time to make a move. The guard scanned the lot, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Zendi held her breath, pressing herself against the crates, trying to make herself as small as possible. The light passed over her hiding spot but didn't linger. The guard muttered something under his breath and continued his search, walking toward the far end of the lot. Zendi let out a slow, quiet breath, her grip on her phone tightening. She glanced at the dog, who was still watching the guard carefully. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. The dog seemed to understand. It nudged her leg gently before turning and heading back toward the way they came. Zendi followed, her steps light and deliberate as they moved through the shadows. Just as they reached the edge of the lot, Zendi heard another voice from inside the warehouse. "Did you see anything?" One of the men called out. "No, it's clear," the guard replied. "Good. Let's hurry up. I don't want to be here longer than we have to," another man said. Zendi didn't stick around to hear the rest. She slipped through the gap in the gate, the dog right beside her. They moved quickly down the alley, not stopping until they were a safe distance away. Finally, they stopped in a quieter part of the street, the bright city lights illuminating their path. Zendi leaned against a wall, catching her breath. The dog sat at her feet, its tail wagging slightly as if to say, "We did it." Zendi crouched down and scratched behind its ears. "You're incredible, you know that?" she said with a small smile. The dog licked her hand in response, making her laugh softly. She opened her phone and replayed the video she had captured. The faces of the men, the cash, and the unmarked packages. It was all there. It wasn't just evidence, it was proof of a serious operation. Zendi knew she couldn't handle this on her own. She needed help. "This isn't over," she said, standing up and looking down at the dog. "But with this video, we've got them. Let's make sure they don't get away with it." The dog barked softly, as if in agreement, and together they set off, ready to take the next step. Zendi stood under the soft glow of a streetlight, reviewing the video she had captured at the warehouse. Her heart was still racing, but the sense of urgency in her chest outweighed her nerves. The images of the men counting cash, sealing packages, and nervously watching the lot painted a clear picture. This wasn't some small-time operation. It was organized and dangerous. The dog stood beside her, alert and steady, as though it understood the gravity of the situation. "You knew this was important," Zendi murmured to the dog, crouching to give it a quick pat. "And now I do too." With her mind made up, she opened her phone and searched for the nearest police station. The map showed it wasn't far, but as she turned to head there, the dog growled softly and turned its gaze back toward the alley they had come from. Zendi followed its eyes, her stomach twisting. In the distance, she could see two shadows moving in the faint light near the warehouse gate. "They're looking for us," she whispered, realizing the men from the warehouse must have noticed something was wrong. She knew they wouldn't let her discovery go unnoticed. The dog barked once, softly but sharply, pulling her focus back. It seemed to signal her to move quickly. "All right, buddy," she said, gripping her phone tightly. "Let's go." Zendi and the dog slipped into the shadows, staying low as they weaved through narrow alleys and side streets. The sound of faint voices and hurried footsteps echoed behind them, confirming her fears. The men were searching. She ducked behind a dumpster, the dog crouching beside her. Peeking around the edge, she saw two men from the warehouse walking briskly, their eyes scanning the area. One of them carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. "She couldn't have gone far," one of them said, his voice tense. "The boss isn't going to be happy if we let her get away." Zendi's breath hitched. She pressed herself closer to the dumpster, her hand instinctively moving to the dog's back to keep it calm. The dog, as if sensing her worry, stayed perfectly still, its sharp eyes focused on the men. The flashlight beam swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. Zendi held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. The dog remained motionless, its body low to the ground, blending into the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, the men moved on, their voices fading as they disappeared around a corner. Zendi exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. "That was too close," she muttered under her breath. The dog barked softly, nudging her leg as if to say, "Keep moving." Zendi nodded. "You're right. We can't stop now." She stood up carefully, making sure the coast was clear before continuing down the alley. The dog led the way, its movements quick and purposeful. It was as if the dog had done this before, like it knew how to navigate the city's maze-like backstreets without being seen. They finally emerged onto a quieter road, away from the immediate danger. Zendi paused to catch her breath, glancing back to make sure they hadn't been followed. The dog sat beside her, panting softly but looking as alert as ever. "We're almost there," she said, pulling up the map again. The police station was just a few blocks away now. She clutched her phone tightly, knowing the video she had captured was the key to exposing the operation at the warehouse. As they moved closer to the station, Zendi couldn't shake the feeling that the men wouldn't give up so easily. They had been too organized, too cautious to let someone walk away with evidence of their operation. But she also knew she had the upper hand. The video on her phone, combined with the dog's sharp instincts, gave her a fighting chance. The dog barked softly again, breaking her thoughts. It stopped in its tracks, its ears twitching as it listened to the faint sounds of the city. Zendi followed its gaze and saw another figure step out from a dark alley ahead of them. The figure paused, looking around, and then began walking in their direction. Zendi's pulse quickened. She didn't wait to see if the person was friend or foe. "Let's move," she whispered to the dog, turning down another side street. The dog led her through a series of winding paths, its movements confident and precise. Zendi trusted it completely now. This dog wasn't just clever, it was her partner in this dangerous situation. Finally, the glowing sign of the police station came into view. Zendi felt a wave of relief wash over her. She quickened her pace, the dog matching her stride. As they approached the station doors, she glanced back one last time. The streets behind them were empty, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. "We made it," she said to the dog, her voice filled with determination. "Now let's make sure they don't get away with this." The dog wagged its tail briefly, as if sharing her resolve. Together, they stepped into the police station, ready to take the next step in uncovering the truth. Inside the police station, Zendi felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The bright lights and the presence of uniformed officers gave her a sense of safety. The dog trotted beside her, its tail wagging slightly but its body still alert. An officer at the front desk looked up as she approached. "How can I help you?" he asked. Zendi wasted no time. "I have evidence of an illegal operation. Smuggling, I think. It's happening in an old warehouse a few blocks from here," she said, holding up her phone. The officer's expression shifted to concern. "All right, let's see what you've got." She quickly unlocked her phone and played the video she had recorded. The officer leaned closer, watching the footage of the men counting cash, sealing packages, and nervously guarding the area. "This is solid," the officer said, nodding. "Where exactly is this warehouse?" Zendi described the location in detail. "It's not far, but I think they know someone's onto them. They were already looking for me when I left." The officer turned to another officer nearby. "Get a team ready. We're moving out." Zendi felt a surge of relief. The wheels were in motion and help was on the way. But before she could fully relax, the dog let out a sharp bark, pulling her attention to the station's front door. Two men entered, their eyes scanning the room. Zendi's heart skipped a beat. They were from the warehouse. She recognized one of them as the man who had stood guard. The dog growled low, its body tense and ready. Zendi stepped closer to the counter, trying to remain calm. "They're here," she whispered to the officer. The officer glanced at the men and gave a slight nod. "Stay behind the desk," he instructed, his voice steady. The two men approached slowly, pretending to look around casually, but their eyes kept darting toward Zendi and the dog. "Evening, officers," one of the men said with a forced smile. "We're just here to report some trouble in the neighborhood." The officer behind the desk didn't blink. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, his tone neutral. The man hesitated, glancing briefly at Zendi. "Just some disturbances. Nothing serious." Zendi's pulse quickened. She could see the tension in their movements, the way their hands twitched slightly at their sides. They weren't here to report anything, they were here to silence her. Before anyone could act, the dog barked loudly, stepping in front of Zendi protectively. The sudden noise startled the men, causing them to take a step back. The officer behind the desk stood up, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Is there a problem here?" he asked firmly. The two men exchanged a glance, their confidence wavering. "No problem," one of them muttered. "We were just leaving." Without another word, they turned and walked out of the station, their stiff movements betraying their frustration. Zendi exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The dog stayed alert, watching the door until the men were out of sight. The officer turned back to Zendi. "Looks like you've stirred up quite a mess," he said, though there was a hint of admiration in his tone. Zendi managed a small smile. "It's not just me. The dog led me to everything. It knew something was wrong from the start." The officer glanced at the dog, who wagged its tail slightly but stayed focused. "Smart dog," he said. "We'll take it from here. You've done your part, and we'll make sure those guys don't get away with anything." Zendi nodded, feeling a mix of relief and determination. "Just make sure they're stopped," she said. The officer smiled. We will. As the team of officers prepared to head to the warehouse, Zendi crouched down to pat the dog. We're not done yet, buddy, she said softly, but we're one step closer. The dog licked her hand, its eyes shining with trust and loyalty. Together, they waited, ready for the next move. The officers didn't waste any time after reviewing Zendi's video. A team quickly suited up, their radios buzzing with updates as they prepared to head to the warehouse. The tension in the station was palpable, but it was clear these officers meant business. Zendi stayed near the front desk, the dog sitting protectively by her side. She watched as officers reviewed her footage again, noting every detail, faces, packages, and the stacks of cash. This is solid evidence, one officer said, nodding toward Zendi. You've done more than most people would have dared to. She gave a small smile. It wasn't just me. The dog led me to everything. The officer glanced at the dog, who wagged its tail briefly but stayed alert. Smart dog, he said with a nod. Looks like it has better instincts than some of us. Another officer approached Zendi. We're heading out now, he said. You've done your part. We'll take care of the rest. Zendi hesitated. Be careful. Those guys are dangerous. They already tried to follow me here. The officer gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry. We're prepared for this. The dog barked softly, its ears perked up as the officers filed out of the station. It seemed to sense the importance of the moment, its body tense but steady. Zendi watched them leave, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over her. She knew the operation was in good hands, but the memory of the men from the warehouse still lingered in her mind. They had been so close to catching her earlier. What if they tried again? The officer at the desk must have noticed her unease. You're safe here, he said firmly. No one's getting to you while you're under our watch. Zendi nodded, though her hands still gripped her phone tightly. She glanced down at the dog, who leaned against her leg as if to reassure her. Minutes passed, and the station's atmosphere remained tense but focused. Zendi could hear updates crackling through the officers' radios, though the words were hard to make out. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm herself. Suddenly, the front door swung open, and an officer entered, his face lit with determination. The team's in position, he announced. They're surrounding the warehouse now. Zendi straightened up, her heart pounding. The dog barked once, its tail wagging slightly as if it knew they were close to victory. She listened intently as the officers in the station communicated with the team on site. The updates were brief but clear. The warehouse was secured, the suspects were being apprehended, and the operation was shutting down. Looks like we got them, one officer said with a smile. Zendi let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The dog wagged its tail again, sensing her relief. Another officer approached her. You did good, he said. Because of you, and that dog, we've taken down a major smuggling ring. This evidence is going to put them away for a long time. Zendi crouched down to the dog's level, ruffling its scruffy fur. You're the real hero here, aren't you? She said softly. The dog barked happily, licking her hand in response. As the officers finished their work, Zendi felt a sense of pride and relief. She had stepped into something dangerous, but with the dog's help, they had made a real difference. Looks like this little adventure is over, she said to the dog, smiling, but something tells me you're not done being a hero. The dog barked again, its tail wagging excitedly, ready for whatever might come next. The next day, the news spread quickly. Headlines talked about the police raid that had shut down a major smuggling operation. The warehouse was filled with evidence, cash, illegal goods, and enough to link the suspects to a larger network of crime. But what caught everyone's attention was the unexpected hero of the story, the scruffy dog that led Zendi to the discovery. The story of the hero dog went viral. Reporters gathered outside the police station, hoping to catch a glimpse of Zendi and the brave pup. People online shared the tale, amazed by how the dog's instincts had uncovered something so significant. Inside the station, Zendi watched the coverage on a small TV in the corner. She smiled as she saw the dog's picture flash across the screen, its scruffy face and alert eyes making it look like a true hero. You're famous now, buddy, she said, crouching down to pet the dog. The dog wagged its tail, leaning into her hand with a happy bark. An officer approached her with a wide grin. You've got yourself a special one there, he said, nodding toward the dog. Most people wouldn't have noticed what this little guy did. Zendi nodded. He's more than special. He knew something was wrong from the start. I just followed his lead. The officer chuckled. Well, you both make a great team. Later that day, Zendi stepped outside the station with the dog by her side. Reporters and bystanders surrounded them, cameras flashing and microphones pushed forward. Zendi, can you tell us more about the dog? One reporter asked. How did it all start? Another chimed in. Zendi raised a hand to quiet the crowd. Honestly, this dog is the real story, she said, glancing down at her furry companion. I was just lucky enough to follow where he led. He's the hero here." The dog barked, drawing laughs and cheers from the crowd. People clapped and called out kind words, and some even brought treats for the dog. It basked in the attention, wagging its tail happily and enjoying every pat and scratch it received. After the excitement died down, Zendi realized she couldn't just part ways with the dog. It had been by her side through every tense moment, and their bond felt unbreakable. As they walked down the quiet street away from the station, she looked down at the scruffy pup. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I think we make a pretty good team. What do you say about sticking together?" The dog barked loudly, its tail wagging like crazy. Zendi laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." She decided to name the dog Scout in honor of its sharp instincts and fearless actions. Scout seemed to love the name, responding to it immediately with an excited bark. Back at her apartment, Zendi made a cozy spot for Scout, complete with a soft bed and a bowl of fresh food and water. The dog settled in quickly, acting as though it had been there all along. Over the next few days, Zendi and Scout became inseparable. Whether she was out running errands or relaxing at home, Scout was always by her side. People in her neighborhood recognized them, often stopping to praise Scout for its bravery. "You've got yourself a real hero," one neighbor said with a smile. Zendi nodded. "I know. I don't think I'll ever meet another dog like him." Scout's fame didn't fade quickly. The story continued to inspire people, and donations poured in to support local animal shelters. Zendi even started working with a group to raise awareness about adopting stray animals, using Scout as the perfect example of how much of a difference one dog could make. And through it all, Scout remained the same scrappy, loyal pup it had always been. Whether chasing a ball in the park or simply lounging at Zendi's feet, it was clear Scout had found its forever home, and a partner for life. As they sat on her balcony one evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Zendi scratched behind Scout's ears and smiled. "Who knew you'd turn my whole week upside down?" she said. Scout barked softly, leaning into her hand. Zendi laughed. "All right, buddy. What do you say we see what adventure comes next?" Scout wagged its tail, ready for anything. Together, they had already done the impossible, and Zendi knew they could face anything the future might bring.